I met Antonio initially as a client. Tony had contacted my office and asked us to represent him because he was having some problems with the federal government. We're very particular as to who we represent, but Tony's also very persistent. Tony actually took the time to fly up from Las Vegas to come and visit with us. I happened to have the time at that point to meet with him. Once I met with him, I decided he would be the type of person I wanted to work for. Tony is that type of person that really is amazing. As to where I see him in 3 years, that's really an interesting question because he's the type of person that could wind up being the mayor of Las Vegas in 3 years. Absolutely resilient, always able to come back from what amounts to very difficult circumstances. And my time with Tony has indicated to me he is that type of person that may be down one moment, but give him a little bit of time and he'll be back on top. I think the Tunnel Vision movie project is very interesting. It's based upon Tony's life, which to me is fascinating to say the least. He's been through more than most of us have been through and could go through in 10 lifetimes. If the Tunnel Vision movie project is resembling his life, I think it would be not only interesting, but an exceptionally good movie. The money structuring law in this country is very complex. Most people don't realize it even exists. I've talked to judges and lawyers that were unaware. What the money structuring law is basically an opportunity for the federal government to attempt to control the flow of cash between individuals. If you attempt to pass $10,000 to purchase any item in cash, the individual receiving the money is required to file a form with the IRS. That form lists not only the amount of money paid in cash, but as well the denominations, the date, and essentially the parties involved. The purpose of that really was back in the early days involving the cocaine trade in South Florida. Because there was so much cash floating around, the government figured the best way to try to enforce the laws was to create new law that punished people for attempting to structure or avoid reporting under what we call the cash transaction reporting requirements. That requirement is really very simple. If you as a merchant or you as a business person receive $10,000 from an individual, you have to report that individual as having paid you $10,000 in cash or more. What's interesting about the law as well, you're not allowed to incrementally break it up. So in other words, you couldn't give someone $5,000 in cash one day, $5,000 in cash the next day, and avoid the reporting requirement. That's called a structuring transaction, which again is a federal felony. So the end result is anytime you're dealing in $10,000 or more in cash, you're required to report it. If you go to your bank and ask for a withdrawal in $10,000 or more in cash, they'll report it for you. In other words, they'll report you for having the cash. Congress recently recognized the absolute unfairness of forfeiture as it related to currency transaction reporting violations. Understand something, this currency could be completely legal, but what would make it illegal is failing to report a $10,000 or more transaction. It doesn't have to be drug money, it doesn't have to be mob money, racket money, prostitution money. It can be money that's perfectly legal but not reported as it should have been. Now if you take that money and go out and buy a car, that car now is subject to being forfeited because it was purchased with what the government terms illegal money. If you go out and you buy real property, that property can be forfeited. So the Congress, seeing the absolute unfairness as far as the application of this rule, has now come back in conjunction with the Department of Justice and created more of a forgiving policy. In other words, forfeiture does not necessarily accompany currency transaction reporting violations or every structuring violation. There is a difference between money laundering and what we call structuring. Money laundering would be if you take, for instance, cash that's been earned illegally through, say, a drug transaction. You have other businesses that you own that may or may not be profitable. So what you do with those other businesses is you take this illegal money and you funnel it to those other businesses, claiming it is income derived by way of those other businesses doing a specific job. Because of that, you're in a situation where you now are laundering dirty money through legitimate business enterprise. If you're structuring, that's a little bit of a different problem. Structuring would be taking, for instance, $10,000 in currency. You want to purchase something that costs $10,500, but you don't want the merchant to report it. So you structure a deal where you give the merchant $5,000 one day, then maybe later that day you come in and you give them $5,500. Now you're structuring a transaction to avoid what we call the currency transaction reporting requirement. If you remember, $10,000 or more must be reported. If you are breaking that up to avoid the reporting requirement, you are essentially structuring a money laundering transaction potentially, or you're simply structuring a transaction to get around the requirement that you report the $10,000 currency transaction.